Today, we're going to embark on a journey of history. We're going to delve deep into the roots and origins of JRPGs, Japanese role-playing video games. This will be a two-part video, and today I'm going to focus on the 80s, which is, after all, the decade where everything began. So here's my top 10 of the most historically important JRPGs, part 1. Alright, let's take a look. Number 10. Sword and Sworcery. At the early 80s, two major video game series were established in the US. Those were Wizardry and Ultima, which could be considered as the fathers of role-playing video games. These franchises influenced famous company Koei to develop titles such as The Dragon and Princess for PC in 1982. It was a text adventure, but it included random encounters that were battles in a very primitive turn-based battle system. Other titles were released the next year, also by Koei, such as Sword and Sworcery, set in a medieval world with an open-ended exploration in towns and castles and battles fought in a one-on-one system through random encounters and based on turns. This game, along with other Koei titles, greatly influenced future entries in the RPG genre in order to compete with giants from the Ultima, Wizardry, and also the Might and Magic series. Number 9. Panorama Tow. In 1983, Nihon Falcom wanted to create a different RPG for computer systems, but with a formula that would deviate from all the other major franchises. The result was Panorama Tow, also known as Panorama Island, which was a fantasy role-playing adventure, as they called it. Its elements were mostly action-oriented based on exploration and survival mechanics, with the main character able to hold conversations with NPCs. It also added status such as stamina and effects such as paralysis. The main character used a gun to attack, and it included the use of a flashlight to brighten dark places. It was a little bit of a science fiction RPG, with battles taking place in real-time combat, but in a very archaic way. I still don't understand why the cover looks medieval with this hot chick with a sword, but maybe it's explained during the storyline of the game itself. Number 8. Dragon's Lair. Panorama Tow wasn't exactly successful, so Nihon Falcom, with a lot of influence from the arcade classic from Namco, Tower of Druaga, came up with what could be really considered as the father of all action RPGs, Dragon's Lair. It was released for computer systems in 1984, and it quickly became the foundation of the genre into a competition against other titles from the mid-80s. It was a major success in Japan. A dungeon crawler played in an overview with the main character having the ability to attack in real time simply by making contact with the enemies. And while it did feature a story, it was more driven by its arcade-style mechanics than anything else. It will also serve as a pioneer in the role-playing industry, although very ironically, despite its huge success in Japan, it was never released anywhere else. Same case with Xanadu, the sequel, released in 1985, and yet another very important RPG in its own history. Number 7. Hydlide. At the end of 1984, 3 months after the release of Dragon's Lair, yet another game was made inspired by the Tower of Druaga, Hydlide. Originally released for the computer systems, it was also a commercial success, and it started a cultural competition against Dragon's Lair since both games were very similar in gameplay mechanics. Hydlide, however, despite having also a general plot of its own, looked slightly better, and it included more detailed animation when the character was attacking or receiving damage. That didn't make it a better game nevertheless, but it was still one of the major competitors at the time in Japan, on this newly arcade-influenced role-playing genre. In 1989, it was ported to the NES, still keeping RPG elements to a minimum, but in a very bad way. This port is considered as one of the worst RPGs on the system, despite having met some success overseas. Number 6. Dragon Warrior. In 1986, with the Famicom still reviving the video game industry, Japan met Dragon Quest, changed to Dragon Warrior in North America to avoid a copyright infringement, with another tabletop game with the same name in the US. Dragon Warrior was developed by Chunsoft with famous designer Yuji Horii at its helm and published by Enix in Japan. It wouldn't meet, however, the outside world until Nintendo published it for the NES in 1989. This created a historical controversy since it is considered as the true father of turn-based JRPGs, still influenced by successful franchises such as Wizardry, but meeting the rest of the world 3 years later after its original release, when other major important JRPGs were already out. Regardless of that, Dragon Quest was a major success, and it literally revolutionized RPGs in Japan, making them lean into similar gameplay mechanics and storytelling to compete against its masterful ideas. Number 5. Ys, Ancient Ys Vanished. In June 1987, Falcom took all positive aspects from Dragon's Lair and Xanadu and developed a new game called Ys, which would later become one of the most emblematic action RPG franchises of all time and possibly the godfather of many. It also created a very symbolic character in JRPG history called Idol Christian, as he will turn out to be the main protagonist in almost every single one of the Ys games. Ys, Ancient Ys Vanished was the first game of a two-part story, originally released for computer systems at the time. It wouldn't meet home consoles until 1 year later on the Famicom, although no versions will be released outside Japan, at least not until the end of 1988 with the Master System, now with the name Ancient Ys Vanished Omen. The name also created a controversy with people believing the pronunciation was Wise due to an error on the packaging of the English release. It's pronounced Ys, and it was probably taken out from the mythical city from the region Brittany on France. In any case, this first entry in the series demonstrated the clearly visible evolution of action RPGs and predecessors such as Dragon's Lair and Hydlide. Number 4. Megami Tensei. Also known as Digital Devil Story, Megami Tensei was also released in 1987, already established as one of the most important years within RPG history. It was made by Atlus, which back then hadn't yet still made a name for themselves in the role-playing industry, but with this controversial title, never released outside Japan, sadly, the Famicom met the enterprise that many years later will become a king within the genre. I said controversial because it involved a direct interaction with demons, whether it was battling against them or even negotiating with them. It was a traditional turn-based RPG, also influenced by the Wizardry series, with a much more solid plot unlike most previous titles in this list that, along with Ys, Ancient Ys Vanished, and Dragon Warrior, attempted a major focus on the plot. Megami Tensei was based on a trilogy of science fiction books by Aya Nishitani that were a major success in Japan. To think that this was the absolute precursor of the now overly popular and cult classic series of Shin Megami Tensei and it has never been released to the rest of the world, although a fan translation was made some years ago. Number 3. Final Fantasy. By the end of 1987, in December, the most popular RPG franchise of all time came into existence. It was conceived by designer Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been previously attempting to create an RPG also influenced by the Ultima and Wizardry series. Square had been denying all his attempts until Dragon Quest became a huge success in Japan. Therefore, finally granting permission to Hironobu to assemble a team and develop his dream project, which will turn into the most successful video game Square had ever published. Still a turn-based RPG, but with battles played in a battle screen similar to a menu screen. It was also slightly story-driven through 4 characters known as the Heroes of Light. The plots games like Final Fantasy had became later a major point in the industry of storytelling within medieval fantasy settings. However, this game wouldn't be localized to North America until 3 years later, in 1990, when Japanese RPGs were barely starting to make a name for themselves. Titles like this, or Dragon Quest, will have to compete there with yet another giant, originally released for the Master System. Number 2. Phantasy Star. Published in 1987 as well, and the next year in North America, this science fiction pioneer was starting to become already a cult classic, unbeknownst yet to the arrival of 2 other major competitors from Japan. Ironically, these had been developed there after Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, but those titles came to North America years after its release here. It was the most expensive game on the Master System in every market. A turn-based RPG with very similar gameplay mechanics, but also including the already iconic dungeon crawling system in first person. It also had one of the first female protagonists ever in an RPG, and one that defied the damsel in distress cliché many other video games had. Her name was Alice, conceived by legendary designer Rieko Kodama. So Sega, under the helm of Mr. Yuji Naka, created this all-time classic that later spawned one of the most historically important RPG franchises of all time and a precursor on the science fiction storytelling within them. Number 1. Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was released for the Famicom on April 1990. Just for that, it shouldn't be on this list, but this title wouldn't exist if it wasn't for all the 80s RPGs that we have seen in this list, mainly because its creator, Shouzo Kaga, wanted to compete with them, but by offering a much different gameplay mechanic than anything else ever seen before in Japan. Fire Emblem laid the foundation of strategy RPGs there, taking elements from a previous title Intelligent Systems had created called Famicom Wars, but now implementing role-playing elements. It was released for the Famicom at the early 90s, but development, production, and even post-production were carried out between Golden Year 1987 and 1988. Fire Emblem was supposed to be released in 1989, but insecurity by both Nintendo and Intelligent Systems, including a lot of problems with advertisement and commercials, delayed its publishing until the next year. Sadly, because of that, and also because of the hardware limitations of the memory chips on the NES, the game was butchered. It was visually unimpressive and met with a commercial failure. Nevertheless, it was the beginning on what will years later become one of the most iconic RPG franchises of all time, overly successful nowadays, and a major influence on other great strategy RPGs in the history of gaming.